Welcome, everyone. My name is Brenda Suggett, and I'm the Executive Director of CARS, which is the Canadian Association of Road Safety Professionals. Welcome to our monthly webinar series, where we host monthly webinars, which are free to our CARS members on salient road safety topics. And this is part of our Knowledge Exchange and Training Hub project, which was made possible through funding from Transport Canada. Welcome to today's webinar, which is entitled Using Cannabis-Impaired Driving Research to Inform Policy Decisions. And I will introduce our two speakers in just a moment. First of all, I wanted to make you aware of an upcoming webinar. This one is being jointly hosted by CARSP and ITE Canada. It's entitled The Road to Transportation Equity, Early Findings from Municipal Policies and Actions. And we will also be doing an update on our conference, our joint conference, which is the ITE Canada CARSP conference to be held in Winnipeg from June 4th to the 23rd, or sorry, June 4th to the 7th. So this upcoming webinar is going to be on, it's open to ITE and CARSP members, as well as other road safety professionals. It's an update on an initiative out of Simon Fraser University, who partnered with Level Up Planning, and they are studying the evolution of municipalities building policies around equity. They want to, when they're doing this study, they also want to make, I should say, they're looking into these policies. And a key part of the policy is to ensure that the policy is affecting those who are most in need. They will be sharing some early findings from an environmental scan of equity policies. It also is a good preview of what is to come in an upcoming workshop, which will be held on June 7th in the afternoon. It's a CARSP workshop from 2 to 4. And it's $50, and it delves into this work that they are doing in more detail. It will talk about lessons learned, case studies, and a real chance to get into the information in a deeper way. And as I mentioned before, that webinar it's on April 19th will also give an update on the CARSP ITE conference. And the theme of the conference is Road Safety, Creating Impact Through Diversity. Now, before I introduce today's speakers, I wanted to go through some housekeeping items. If you have questions throughout today's two presentations, we ask that you submit them through the Q&A function. And you can do it at any time, but questions will be answered at the end. Now, you're welcome to chat, so feel free to do that with each other, but we do ask you to keep your questions to the Q&A. Now, without further ado, I would like to now introduce our two speakers. We have two people from the Traffic Injury Research Foundation. Robin Robertson is the president and CEO of TURF. She holds a Master of Criminology applied degree. During her 23 years in the research field, Robin has published more than 350 reports and articles on a broad range of road safety issues with a focus on education, policy, and program development and evaluation. She's also delivered technical assistance for road safety programs in several countries and is the author of TURF's Knowledge Translation Model, which is the basis for TURF's many educational programs. Robin is well-versed in implementation strategies and operational practices across transportation, criminal justice, and health systems and industry. She is a member of and has served on several academic and professional boards and committees. And she is joined today by Steve Brown, who is a research associate with TURF. He is just mentioned about TURF being a world leader in research, safety programs, and policy development. Since 1991, he has managed TURF's National Fatality Database, which is a valuable source of data for reports and peer-reviewed articles on various road safety topics. He has co-authored the Alcohol Crash Problem Report, an annual publication that examines the current state and historical trends for alcohol and drug use among fatally injured drivers. Steve has also co-authored several reports and articles on distracted driving, impaired driving, and the impact of COVID-19 on road safety. He has worked on a variety of research topics such as lifestyle factors among young drivers, distracted driving, bicycle safety, winter driving, and elderly drivers. He has also represented TURF at various conferences, including CARST, CCMTA, CACP, and ICATS. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our two speakers. So thank you very much for being here.
Thanks.
Great, thanks, Brenda. So we're going to spend a little bit of time, Steve and I, sharing the presentation, talking a little bit about first some of the latest drug data in fatal crashes in Canada, and also talking about some of the latest research and educational resources that are available with respect to drug impaired driving. So Steve, if you wanted to share your screen.
Okay.
For the presentation. For those of you not familiar with the Traffic Injury Research Foundation, we are an independent road safety research institute. One of the main focuses of our research is road user behavior, and increasingly our work touches on aspects of infrastructure and engineering and vehicle design and technology. And we not only maintain Canada's national fatality data collected from coroners' offices and medical examiners, but we also engage in program and policy development as well as evaluation. And one of the most important things we do is spend our time talking to practitioners. So Steve, if you wanted to advance the slides through the About TURF. There we go. And put it in slideshow. Just to give you, an overview, Steve's going to talk about the latest drug data. You can keep going, Steve, please. To the overview slide. There we go. So some of the things we're going to talk about today, I'm going to start a little bit just to provide some context for cannabis legislation, which we're seeing in many countries around the world. And then we'll talk about the latest with fatal crash data with drugs, and then talk about some of the additional resources and research that is available. So on the next slide. So a lot of countries have been looking at the issue of cannabis legislation. It's become quite the hot topic in many countries around the world. So as of 2022, cannabis had been legalized for recreational use, not only in Canada, but in Georgia and Malta, in Mexico and South Africa, as well as Uruguay. And then 19 states, 2 territories in the District of Columbia in the United States have all legalized recreational cannabis, and many more of them also have medical cannabis. The issue of legalizing recreational cannabis has also been talked about in Australia, not just the Australian Capital Territory, but also some of the other states. And we actually had representatives from Australia visit our offices last summer, really to learn from the Canadian experience legalizing recreational cannabis. And they took the opportunity to meet with many other organizations as well. And then in Europe, in addition to Malta, Germany, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, all came together to talk about legalizing recreational cannabis. And well, one of the countries moved forward. The other 2 are still discussing it. In addition, there's been interest in introducing legislation to legalize recreational cannabis in Spain and Italy and Portugal and France. So it's really become a bit of an international issue, and one of the most important questions, you know, as a basis for legislation is really, what do we know about cannabis? And that's what we're going to talk about today. So on the next slide, Steve, I think you can start talking about the fatal crash data. So over to you.
Okay, thanks. In this chart here, just being asked to start my video, pardon me, we have the testing rate for drugs among drivers that were killed in crashes. In 2000, only 37% of drivers that were killed were tested for the presence of drugs. And you can see in 2010 that rose to 56%, and in 2020 it was 77%. Now, bear in mind that while there's been an increase in the percentage of drivers that were tested for the presence of drugs, by comparison, over this 20-year period, 80% of drivers, 80 to 85% were tested for the presence of alcohol. So in terms of testing for drugs, you know, we've seen some catching up. So it's not quite where alcohol is, but drivers are tested a lot more frequently than they used to be. And among those drivers that are tested, you can see that 34% were tested positive for any drug in the year 2000. And in 2020, that was 55%. Now, it could be cannabis, it could be prescription drugs, or it could be over-the-counter drugs. We're talking about any drug when we say 55%. Now, if we look at the drivers that tested positive for drugs, among that particular group, almost 55% tested positive for cannabis in 2020. And we see that 36% tested positive for central nervous system depressants. That would be your benzodiazepines, for example. Almost an identical percentage tested positive for CNS stimulants, such as cocaine, amphetamines, methamphetamines. And then we have 19% that tested positive for narcotic analgesics. Now that would include you know, some cold medications with codeine in that. It would also include you know, fentanyl, oxycodone. So in that broad group, it's 19%. And as you can see, those numbers don't add up to 100%. And this means that some of the fatally injured drivers that tested positive for drugs, they tested positive for more than one type. You could have drivers testing positive for cannabis and CNS depressants. And although it's not shown in this chart, some of those could have also tested positive for alcohol. Now, if we look at the prevalence of the drugs among the drivers in the fatal crashes, we can see among fatally injured drivers, that females were more likely to test positive for drugs than male. Now, many of those would be CNS depressants, because later on we see that males were more likely to test positive for cannabis and CNS stimulants. Now, if we use the age 35 as sort of our dividing line, we can see that the positive tests for drugs were more prevalent among the younger drivers under age of 35 in comparison with drivers that were over age 35. And we found that drivers aged 20 to 34 were the most likely to test positive for drugs among fatally injured drivers. And cannabis was more prevalent among the younger drivers, whereas older drivers were more likely to test positive for CNS depressants. And we didn't see much difference. We found on the weekends 56% of fatally injured drivers were positive for drugs, and it was 50 in weekday crashes. So it was not as pronounced a difference as you would see for alcohol, where a higher percentage would test positive on the weekends than on weekdays. This is a rather busy looking figure, so I'll just sort of walk you through it here. The dark blue represents the percentage of drivers testing positive for cannabis within each of the age groups. And as you can see, among 16 and 19 and 20 to 34-year-olds, that percentage, those age groups have the highest that tested positive for cannabis. But as you move across the right to the older age groups, you can see that percentage testing positive for cannabis dropping, where it's down to 7% among drivers age 65 and older. And interestingly, you see the same trend. If you look at the red columns, that represents CNS stimulants. So you can see once again that the highest percentage was the 20 to 34 age group, and then progressively that declines to where it's only 3.2% among those over 65. On the other hand, if you look at the orange column, that would be CNS depressants. As we move across the right, only 11% were positive among 16 and 19-year-olds, but it was 31.5% among 65 and older. So we're seeing different drug types among the different age groups here. Now, if we look specifically at cannabis, among fatally injured drivers, 15.9% tested positive in 2010, or in 2000, and it was the same percentage in 2010. And then we have almost double that number, 31% testing positive in 2020. So there's been a large increase in the percentage testing positive for cannabis just within the last decade. If we look at males during this period, we can see that 17.5% were positive in 2000, and then it went up to 31.6% in 2020. Females was much lower back in 2000. It was only 8% females testing positive, but then it almost tripled to 23.2% in 2020. Here's another rather busy chart. If you look at the orange, that's the 20 to 34-year-olds. And gradually, a larger percentage of those were testing positive for cannabis from 2000 to up to actually it's 2020. And they surpassed the 16 and 19-year-olds. In fact, if you look at the 16 and 19-year-olds, that's the it's the bluish line. You can see that there was a real drop between 2019 and 2020. That was the only age group where there was a drop. So that's going to take some further monitoring, whether this is just a one-time blip or whether, there's going to be a continued trend. Because if you look at the other three age groups, you can see for at least the last 5 years that there's been a steady increase in the percentage of those that were testing positive for cannabis. And even the 65 and over, that's the line on the bottom. You can see over the last 5 years that it's gone from almost a flat line up to just over 10%. Typically during this period, there's been substantially higher percentage of drivers testing positive for alcohol than cannabis. Alcohol, the orange line here, is it's much higher than cannabis. But then when you get to the last 3 or 4 years, and then over to 2020, you can see that it's pretty small difference. 31.6% testing positive for alcohol and 30.1% testing positive for cannabis. So it remains to be seen, whether cannabis will overtake alcohol among fatally injured drivers. We only have a few of the provinces' data for 2021 at this stage, so it's too early to make any comments on that. The blue columns represent the percentage of drivers testing positive for cannabis just over the last 5 years, and you can see that it's gradually increased. We also looked at the pre-legal period. That would be before October 2018, and then we had like a legal period. So in the pre-legal period, 24% of drivers were positive for cannabis, and then it's increased to 28%, just over the last 2 years and a bit there. We also have the road safety monitor, and it's a online survey that we do each year, and respondents are asked about their attitudes, their driving practices, and their perceptions of the severity of various road safety issues, from distracted driving to drinking and driving, younger drivers, older drivers. And we did ask how many of them drove within 2 hours of consuming various drugs. And cannabis is the orange. That's the, you can see that in 2016, just over 2% were positive or said that they drove within 2 hours of using cannabis. And that's risen to 7.3% in 2022. And also of note, you'll notice that the red column, cannabis and alcohol, that has increased from 1% in 2016 to 4% who said yes, they drove within 2 hours of using both of those substances. And prescription drugs, we've seen that more people have admitted to driving after using prescription drugs. Particularly from between 2018 and 2019, the number increased substantially. So perhaps when the recreational use of cannabis was legalized, maybe people felt more comfortable admitting that they were driving after using other substances. We'll have to look at that over the next few years and see what the trends show there. We also asked drivers how concerned they were about different issues, and one of the questions was, how concerned are you about drug-impaired driving? So these would be people that would have great concern or extremely concerned, and it was just under 69% in 2011, and it's gradually risen, and it's now at 73% in 2022. So we'll have to see there whether the level of concern is still up there. And I'll pass it back to Robin.
Perfect. Thanks, Steve. So yeah, as you can see, over the last several years, we are seeing that upward trend. And I suspect that's not dissimilar from what other countries are experiencing. And that was really the impetus for the International Council on Alcohol, Drugs and Traffic Safety, ICATS, to form a working group around drugged driving. There's a lot of good research being released, and it's being released steadily. So it's very hard to keep abreast of the issue, and answers to important questions are needed for policymakers to be able to craft legislation in a way that protects the public and ensures that they're safe on the roads, at the same time without infringing on people's personal choices in terms of what they want to do. So for that reason, a group of us came together to form a drug driving work group that involved myself and Jan Ramakers from Maastricht University and Tom Arkell from Swinburne University. So we thought it would be a good idea to create a series of fact sheets that were really for policymakers that answered some of the key questions, particularly, as I mentioned at the outset, as many countries are exploring strategies for cannabis legalization. What's interesting with respect to this issue is they're more often led by health, and transportation has more of a backseat. So excuse the pun, but transportation has not been as heavily involved in terms of leading these initiatives as has health. And the whole impaired driving issue has just received less attention. Cannabis legalization brings a host of different issues with it that need to be managed and addressed in different ways. So impaired driving wasn't really one of the top issues that came to the top, and we thought it was important to ensure that as countries move forward, they do have an understanding of how legislation can potentially impact the safety of people on the roads in their countries. And in particular, this is an issue because the way legislation is crafted and the allocation of resources that go into that legislation has the potential to dramatically affect whether or not we're making progress or losing ground when it comes to impaired driving in the coming years as a result. So on the next slide, Steve, You can see that there was quite a diverse group. We had 24 researchers who focus on this particular topic from 11 countries who contributed to the fact sheets. So it was actually a well-organized, well-oiled machine to get these processed. So here's just an acknowledgement of the many experts who participated in the work group and made this fact sheet series possible, including Christine Wickens from the Center for Addiction and Mental Health here in Canada, as well as Jeff Brubaker at the University of British Columbia. So many thanks to our Canadian colleagues as well as those in other countries. So on the next slide, Steve, I'm going to talk a little bit about, at a high level, each of the fact sheets. So there's an introductory fact sheet, which is really focused on distinguishing between the drug control aspect and the road safety aspect in countries where cannabis continues to be illicit. There seems to be more of an emphasis on drug control, and that is not necessarily the same as the focus on road safety. But what really was emphasized in this particular fact sheet is when cannabis is legalized, it's important that the strategy around impaired driving is really focused on separating people who are impaired from their use of vehicles while they're impaired, as opposed to drug control per se. So it talks a little bit about that important distinction with legislation, and it also talks a little bit about the availability of medical cannabis as well as CBD cannabidiol products, and kind of explains some of those nuances between those different products. So on the next slide, the second fact sheet talks about the experimental evidence, and really what we wanted to do with this fact sheet and the next one on epidemiological evidence was to provide some context for how the research is done, so that people can understand some of the strengths and the limitations of what we can answer and what we can find answers to versus what we cannot. So with respect to the experimental evidence, it talks about some of the most common measures of driving performance, which include standard deviation of lane position, reaction time, headway, and speed. Explains the use of simulators and the importance of having baseline and dose conditions. It also explains why we don't have real world studies looking at impairment while driving, because that would be very, very dangerous. It also talks about cannabis impairment and how it's very unlike alcohol. It really is dependent on biological characteristics, on the amount of the dose or the THC concentration, what's consumed, how much is consumed, the method of ingestion. So it talks about all those different factors that can influence your level of impairment ultimately. And it also talks about cannabis intoxication and recovery from it. So how long does it take for those impairing effects to wear off? And essentially, it's not a fixed. It's just like your level of impairment isn't standardized really like it is with alcohol. Similarly, how long it takes for the effects to wear off also varies greatly between individuals. And it also makes a distinction between looking at an individual level. If they are test positive, essentially, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're impaired. So it really talks about those individual differences and how we can't make comparisons between individuals. And it also touches a little on the evidence with respect to alcohol and cannabis and what those impairing effects are. So on the next slide, we talk a little bit about the epidemiological evidence. We talk about how in real world studies, and as Steve talked about in the fatal crash data, that the THC is typically most commonly detected recreational drug and roadside surveys after alcohol. The prevalence of cannabis and alcohol is also generally higher in crash-involved drivers than in roadside surveys. And it talks about crash risk and what that is and how it's measured with respect to impairment. And it makes the case that cannabis is associated with a modest increase in crash risk at the population level, but that can't be generalized, so to speak, to individuals. So there's impairment at the population level. Just because we can identify impairment at a population level doesn't mean individuals are impaired specifically. So again, emphasizing that distinction. And then it talks about crash risk relative to THC concentrations and how data is limited, but there is some to suggest that risks increases for drivers with whole blood with more than 5 nanograms of THC. So with both the experimental and the epidemiological evidence, the limitations of the research are also discussed and presented. So on the next slide is the fourth fact sheet on detection and toxicology. We were very fortunate to have Marilyn Hustis involved to lead this particular work group. And again, it talks about the differences in predicting impairment at a population level versus an individual level. It says that the association with impairment is clearest in occasional cannabis users and not so much in chronic frequent cannabis users. It talks about the issue of partial tolerance and how that works. It also makes important distinctions between blood concentrations of THC versus oral fluid concentrations and how those are not, you can't predict one from the other. It talks about some of the issues related to per se limits to distinguish between impaired versus non-impaired. And again, with alcohol, we have research and science that's a very clear cut. When it comes to cannabis, it's not. So it talks about some of the cautionary notes around per se limits. And then with respect to detection, it looks at SFST, standardized field sobriety tests, and whether or not cannabis can be used to detect cannabis impairment. And it's important in that regard. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has noted that the tests were not designed for this purpose when they were designed, but some work that's talked about is underway, looking at doing a closer examination of whether or not cannabis can be detected. Certainly the HGN, the horizontal gaze nystagmus test is not a good indicator of cannabis impairment, but the other two, the walk and turn and the one leg stand, have a little more validity, but research is underway looking at that particular issue. So on the next slide, the fifth fact sheet was about policy and legislation, and again, really emphasizing the difference between individual rights and achieving a balance between individual rights and road safety. Certainly in Canada, we have that with Section 1 of the Charter, that it's a reasonable limitation on your rights and freedoms when you're driving on the road to make sure that others are also safe. And again, with respect to legislation, it talks about the use of per se limits and their value versus behavioral measures, like the standardized field sobriety tests and the drug recognition expert, the DRE evaluation, as measures of impairment. It also talks about some of the differences between impairment in blood versus impairment according to behavioral tests. It talks about medical cannabis and driving exemptions and what we know about that issue to support legislation. It asks the question about whether or not cannabis should be treated like alcohol, and the answer is really no. No, it should not, because it's very different. And a main challenge has been the innate desire to overlay the framework of alcohol, which is very well established and very familiar to cannabis, because it would be nice and it would be easier, but it's not necessarily the best approach. And then it also looks at opportunities to evaluate laws and whether or not they are having a deterrent effect and what types of enforcement tools are available and how effective are they. So on the next slide, the last fact sheet was on medical cannabis and novel psychoactive substances. So it defines what medical cannabis is. And I think the main takeaway for this fact sheet is, you know, that it's used to relieve symptoms and to treat individuals under medically supervised conditions. So there's using medical cannabis, and then there's using it, you know, under the care of a physician to ensure that your symptoms are being treated appropriately, that it's you know, creating improvements, and that you're not impaired as a result of it. It does address the issue of tolerance, particularly among medical cannabis users, and how their THC levels might be much higher, but that's not an indication that they're impaired. And it also notes that medical consumers often use lower THC products. Generally, the medical products are CBD and or THC. So we know that CBD alone doesn't affect driving performance, but often the medical cannabis products have some level of THC in them. And as soon as that CBD is combined with either THC or something else, you know, it's not so clear cut in terms of whether or not it affects driving performance. This fact sheet also looks at the issue of synthetic cannabinoids. The prevalence is very low, but some of the research coming out of Australia suggests that the impairing effects are quite intense and unpredictable. And certainly police at roadside have detected a number of cases, and the impairment is just very, very significant. So a lot more work needs to be done looking at the synthetic cannabinoids, but essentially it's right now it's not, they're difficult to detect with a roadside test. Generally labs need specialized equipment to detect them. So yeah, so on the next couple of slides are just some examples of the social media ads that we've created. If you're interested in sharing with your networks information from the fact sheets on cannabis and driving, when they were released last August at the ICATS conference in Amsterdam, we had press releases go out in a number of countries because it is such a topical issue. So if you can just show the next few slides with the social media ads. I'm going to take a few minutes and just talk about some of the cannabis enforcement issues, because having cannabis legislation is one thing, being able to enforce that legislation is quite another. So on the next slide, a little bit about cannabis enforcement in Canada and the number of police officers. So since the DRE program was rolled out in 2008, there's been a huge push to train drug recognition experts, which is quite costly and time consuming, and is probably one of the hardest certifications for police officers to attain. As of 2020, there were more than 1,300 trained DREs in Canada and 27,300 standardized field sobriety test officers. And those SFST trained officers are important because that is a foundation for the DRE test. There were about 6,000 DRE evaluations in Canada. And the important thing to understand is the distinctions between the alcohol legislation enforcement process and the drug impaired legislation enforcement process. They're very different, and the protocols for officers at roadside are quite complex. And then we have not only the criminal layer, but also an administrative layer as well. And often there can be delays in the DRE exam being performed. A lot of Canada is rural. A lot of jurisdictions don't have an adequate number of DRE officers. So as a result, when drug impairment's detected at roadside, it can take a while. There can be delays to get a DRE officer. And that's also true in the US. And for that reason, within the DRE program, there is now a push to, as soon as cannabis is detected, to get the samples, get the forensic samples, to collect them, because it dissipates so quickly, particularly in blood. And that's something that a lot of jurisdictions in the US are now pursuing, because that cannabis can essentially disappear while there are delays to, to get the DRE and to get the exam done. And as Steve talked about in fatal crashes, we're seeing a growing presence of drugs, and that's also true in arrest data. But unfortunately, the drug-impaired driving cases proceed through the courts much more slowly, and the retention and certification of DREs is an issue, again, not just in Canada, but in the US, because of the challenges in officers keeping their certification and having a place to recertify, essentially. So on the next slide, again, similar issues in the United States. They certainly have more DRE officers, and they also have a strong and concerted push to get more and to train more. And because in Canada, we're relying on spots in the US to train and certify our officers, in many cases, we kind of have to wait till spots are ready. And with the US upping their testing, that means ultimately fewer slots for us. So again, their DRE calls in their database in the US, their DRE calls for drug impairment are accurate about 80% of the time. They did about 3,000 determinations, which no impairment was called, and that can be a function of a couple of different things, but one is the delays in testing, and by the time the DRE does the exam, there's no more drug in their system, or no more impairment that can be measured. There's a lot of variations in lab and forensic testing, which I'll talk about. And again, the retention and certification issues are even more compounded in the US because of some high profile media cases, the emphasis on some of the events that have unfolded where citizens have been injured, use of force issues. There's been a whole conversation around defunding, to a poor term, defunding police. So there's a lot of political issues now associated with enforcement as well, which are very pronounced in the US. So all of these factors have important implications for the enforcement of drug-impaired driving legislation. On the next slide, there have been some reports done around toxicology issues and the ability of labs to keep up with the forensic testing associated with drug-impaired driving enforcement. A lot of labs lack capacity. They have horrendous backlogs in testing. There are differences between whole blood versus serum blood versus oral fluid. What's being used is the forensic test. The panels, the cutoff levels are also inconsistent, and the National Safety Council has a committee on alcohol, drugs, and driving, and they've been surveying their labs in the US in an effort to identify and to address some of these issues and to promote best practices and standards for labs. Some of the issues that labs are struggling with, and a lot of these issues are not just in the US, they're also in Canada. There is a lack of resources for new equipment, and the onboarding of equipment takes time. There's a whole process for new equipment to be validated in the lab before it can be used in testing. And then we have the whole issue of novel psychoactive substances, which are being seen more frequently, and most state labs aren't able to test for that, and most labs outsource it to NMS Labs, which is a private lab in the US, and that's also true for Canada, because keeping up with the protocols to test for these NPS are quite challenging. Okay, next slide. Last thing I want to talk about is there has been some discussion around cannabis, recreational cannabis consumption spaces. So these are spaces where people could legally consume cannabis in a public spot. And BC was the first jurisdiction to put out a consultation on this particular topic. And they talked about some of the different places where they may see recreational cannabis, and that included in cooking classes, in spas, but also at concert venues, in licensed establishments that sell alcohol, and a kind of a range of different public spaces. So they did do a consultation and suggested starting small, kind of to pilot some of these spaces and use a learn as you go approach. So on the next couple of slides are really some of the issues that we saw as an organization, and that other safety organizations who work in the road safety space have identified as well. So we did put together a submission, and we released a report 2 or 3 weeks ago that was really about some of the questions and some of the issues that need to be addressed as part of a consultation about whether or not to permit cannabis consumption spaces. And I think one of the biggest issues is what Steve showed in his presentation, where we see increases in fatal crash data involving cannabis. We see increases in self-report cannabis and alcohol, and alcohol. So in the face of that upward trend, and also in the face of the challenges of having good tools to identify impairment outside of the DRE program and oral fluid testing, that would be quite a burden to put on licensed establishments. If you think about how there's server training, for example, for alcohol, to prevent over service. We don't have any tools or strategies as it relates to cannabis. So essentially it might be a little bit premature to move forward with recreational cannabis consumption spaces until there are opportunities to have some more dialogue around these issues, and to ensure ultimately that we're not adding to the impaired driving problem, and we're not losing ground in what we've achieved in reducing it. So the next couple of slides just highlight some of the points that we had talked about as part of our submission. And I think I will stop there and turn it back over to Brenda.
Thank you so much, Robin and Steve, for doing that presentation. It's very interesting, this consortium that put together these fact sheets, and I actually put the link in the chat area if people would like to go there and download those. Just an amazing venture with 20 plus researchers from across the world, and it's interesting to see that we're all kind of dealing with the same issues, and it's repeating in different countries. And it's great to be able to come together and share information and try and strategize on how to combat some of these issues. So we do have a couple of questions which have come in so far. And so if people could just keep submitting your questions through the Q&A, and I will start with the two that we have. So the first person asked, how can we get access to the 2020 coroner data on the presence of alcohol and drugs in fatal collisions? And maybe that question is to Steve.
Yes. Now that would depend on which coroner or medical examiner's office you're dealing with. For example, when we're putting together our fatality database, in some provinces we have to enter a research agreement before we can obtain the data, and there's others that other coroners and medical examiners put out their own fact sheets on various topics, such as trends in alcohol use, trends in drug use. I would say if you get in touch with us, we not only have 2020 data, but we have data for all the jurisdictions going back as far as 1987. And our database is unique, and not only that we have the coroner data, but we also have police reported collision data. So there would be information on vehicle type, and you know, the how many vehicles were involved in the crash, for example. So it's not a straight answer for some of the provinces. You know, you could get in touch with them directly. Others, you might be better served, you know, getting in touch with us.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Steve. Second question, and I might need a little clarification from, it was Zina Chiwaka, and he asks, what are the diagnostic tools available as to the level of substance impairment to members of the medical community? So are you asking then whether people who are interacting with the public, like for instance, family doctors, if they have diagnostic tools to determine drivers' fitness to operate a motor vehicle? I guess in the case of CNS depressants, is that what you were thinking, Zina? And we could unmute him, Navoda, if you're able to.
So what I can say is certainly in the treatment community, there are a number of assessment tools for both drug impairment, there's and alcohol impairment. Yeah, off the top of my head, one of the things that we published a few years ago with funding from the Canadian Institutes for Health Research was looked at risk assessment tools that were available for alcohol, and a number of them were also available for drugs. I think the challenge is certainly on the treatment side is using tools that are validated on an impaired driver population as opposed to a general population. So there's certainly some tools for general population, some tools for an impaired driver population. And then there's also some screening and brief interventions tools that have been utilized, but the extent to which they're validated for drugs, I'm not certain. And then the licensing authorities in each jurisdiction have also requirements around fitness to drive, and that's been one of the challenges, is what are the good fitness to drive assessment tools, for example, that might be used at functional assessment centers that measure specific skills to driving and impairment in those areas. So yeah, so that's, I hope that answers your question.
It does, and that is what he was trying to get at in his question. So no, you did a great job. Thank you. Okay, so another question is from Bruce Haycock, and he says, in his presentation, Steve noted an increasing trend of testing positive for cannabis in fatally injured drivers. Similar trends have been observed post-legalization in the US. However, that could arguably be observing population level increased usage due to legalization. Has there been an accompanying increase in total fatalities in the affected groups over the same period? And then he puts in brackets, in the US publication, I believe total fatalities remained fairly flat.
So US fatalities have actually gone through the roof. They lost the equivalent of a decade of gains, reducing fatals in a single year. So since the COVID pandemic, there are over 40,000 fatalities, and certainly in some of the jurisdictions, like in Washington, they've seen an uptick in cannabis impaired fatal crashes and polysubstance use. Probably what's more interesting in Washington is the extent of poly use as opposed to, you know, one or two substances. There's really a lot of mixing of substances. And in Colorado, they also saw an increase in fatal crashes, but it's sort of leveled off as, I guess, people have settled into cannabis use. They've kind of found not a baseline. They found they've plateaued. So they're not, in the initial years following legalization, they did see an increase, and then it did somewhat level off. And Steve, I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
I don't want to add too much other than to say that if you look at other issues, alcohol use, the use or non-use of seatbelts, distraction, you'll see where the percentage of those issues as a percentage of total deaths, it will increase. It'll go up for several years, and then eventually, it'll peak or plateau. What you have to be mindful of, though, is if we see a decrease, it might not be a permanent decrease. We might get some ebbs and flows over the years, because in terms of the cannabis, it's still relatively new in terms of it being monitored. I mean, the testing rate at 80% for drugs, that certainly helps. I mean, you can look at the data more confidently than you could 20 years ago.
Okay, thank you so much to both of you. And I have a question from Kim Miller, and she asks, in order to better educate road users, how far away are we from a standard joint? It is easy to educate road users regarding alcohol, but not so easy with cannabis. So I guess a way to sort of frame it, to say how many you should have, kind of thing, before you get impaired.
Yeah, and I honestly think that would be incredibly difficult to achieve, simply because the THC level across products varies. Their serving size, I guess, for lack of a better word, is different. So often it's easier to talk about the impairment in skills. So alcohol impairs certain skills, cannabis impairs certain skills. There's certainly some overlap there, but there's also some differences. And I think the most important point that we really need to educate people on is, just because you don't feel as impaired using cannabis as you do using alcohol doesn't mean you're not impaired. It just means you don't feel as impaired. So I think we need to do a better job educating people in terms of how to assess their level of impairment. And it's the same with alcohol. When you are drinking and you're kind of on the absorption curve and your BAC is going up, then you feel impaired, and you stop drinking, and then your BAC starts to come down and you feel better. And people make the assumption that I'm okay to drive, and it's like, no, you're just less impaired than you were before, which is why you feel better, but you're not okay to drive. So helping people understand some of those issues in terms of understanding how alcohol and cannabis affects them, so they know what to be more sensitive to, and they have a good sense of how their skills are impaired, instead of just, going with, I feel okay, so I'm going to drive.
And I guess there's the whole issue of edibles too, and the delayed reaction where they feel those effects. Yeah. I have a couple of, we don't have any more coming in through the audience, but I had a couple of questions regarding this collaboration that put these together. I just wondered what the reaction is. You mentioned that there are some jurisdictions, some countries that are kind of looking to these to give them an idea of, should we legalize? And I was just curious what the reaction is to, by some of those who haven't legalized, and what their decision is. And the other question I have is whether you are going to continue to collaborate and kind of keep each other posted in terms of what's happening. I mean, you've identified a lot of great issues, and there's a lot of research and work that needs to happen. I'm just wondering if there's any next steps for this collaborative venture. Yeah,
so certainly ICATS continues to be actively involved in the issue, and certainly becoming a member of ICATS is a great way to stay in tune with all the research that's coming out. I think with respect to the fact sheets, they were very timely. Getting them done and getting them out was very timely, because it was at a time when a lot of jurisdictions were discussing the issue, and that was really the intention for the work group, is as you're discussing legalization, please use facts, please use the latest research, please have a good understanding of what that research means and what it doesn't. So yeah, so we've got a good response from it. And I know a number of associations of toxicologists and road safety professionals and health professionals shared them widely through their network. The fact sheets are being translated into French by our colleagues in Belgium. Dr. Alain Verstraet is taking the lead on that. So we're hoping to have French versions of the fact sheets available as well. And I think some of the other countries have also taken steps to translate them into other languages as well. So yeah.
Very good. Okay, I think that brings us to the close of our webinar hours. So I once again just want to thank so much Robin Robertson and Steve Brown from Traffic Injury Research Foundation for giving us that amazing update on so many different fronts. So thank you so much. And yeah, everybody check out those fact sheets. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Brenda.
You're
Thanks
very
a lot, Brenda.
welcome. Take care. Thanks, Navoda.